Routing is a relatively huge topic, and in this playlist, we are barely scratching the surface. Till this point, whatever we did is within one or two components within the hierarchy. But in an actual application, that's not the case. Based on the URL of the browser, we can add a configuration to let Angular know that if the URL is just slash, show this component. If the URL is slash recipes, then another component. If the URL is recipes slash some ID, then another component, and so on. This helps decoupling the components from the hierarchy. We can move from one view to another by changing the URL of the browser. This section, whether we like it or not, are doing two things. One, learn a new concept, and two, refactor the existing code base. Like I said before, as a developer, this is a part of our daily life, and so let's enjoy that process. Since there is a lot of moving pieces, let's take small steps together. Let me explain the concept of routing in a simpler manner without all the bells and whistles. The concept of routing in single-page application is a make-believe magic. Since there is only one single HTML page, which is the index.html, the app is made to render inside that page dynamically by the framework. Since app.html is the root component's HTML file, the framework puts a component called router outlet there, and based on a configuration object, various components are swapped within this placeholder. For example, if the browser URL is domain/, it will load homepage. If the browser URL is domain/recipes, this component would be loaded here. If the browser URL is domain/recipe/something dynamic, then recipe detail would be loaded in this placeholder. That's how routing works in a nutshell. For our application, this is what I have as plans. When the browser URL is domain/ or localhost 4200/, let's show the home component as the view. When the browser URL is domain/recipes, let's show the recipe list component. And when it is domain/recipe/something dynamic, let's show the recipe detail component. Of these, we need to create a home component and a navbar component that can be used as a common navigation section to move between different views. The current setup also changes. Currently, recipe detail is inside the HTML of recipe list and is conditionally displayed based on the selection status of the recipe. This will totally change. Let's scaffold two components, home and navbar, together. The flag here is to omit the spec files from being created. NGGC home creates a home component, and --skip-test will omit the spec files from being created. Same goes for the navbar component. So once we hit enter, this will scaffold both components together without the spec files. We can see that there is a home page and there is a navbar created both without the .spec files. When the application bootstraps, we have learned that main.ts is the first TS file that's getting executed. Within the main.ts, there is an app config reference. If you go to definition of that, we can see that this is also a configuration object with a provider's property having an array within which there is something called provide router. This function helps us in configuring the routes for the whole application. It's already passed a route, so if you go to the definition of that, as of now, this is an empty array. It's here that we need to add the configuration for the project specific routing. If we do an empty object and then say when the path is empty and the path match is full, I'll come to this a bit later. Please load the component hope. Similarly, let's copy this. Let's do recipes. We don't need the path much here. Let's do recipe list. And whenever the path is recipes/something dynamic, we need to load the recipe detail component. So this is the basic configuration for routing. The styles and HTML for navbar has already been added to save some time. It's just some HTML and CSS. There is nothing specific. Let me open up and show you. This is just a bare minimum HTML and its corresponding styles. Check the description for the source code of both of those. Next step is to put the router outlet, for which we need to open up two files, the app.ts and the app.html. App.ts is opened up, and let me open up the app.html on the side. I don't need these two, so let me remove everything that we don't need at this point. Let's clean up the page. And within the imports array, let's import the router outlet so that we can use the router outlet component provided by the framework. Since we already have the navbar, let's import that so that we can put the navbar right above the router outlet. Switch to web view and confirm that we can see the navbar. The next step is to make sure that clicking on the links, the home and the recipes, should at least take us to the respective components, and the browser URL should reflect that. Currently in navbar.html, what we see are links, and there is one problem here. The moment we click on a link, it sends a request to the backend for a new page, and so the page gets refreshed. This is a strict no-no in the single page application world. To prevent this default functionality of the links, we use a special property called router link. All we need is to import the router link directive and use the router link here. Let's point it to slash for home, and let's point it to slash recipes to navigate to the recipe component. Let's switch back to the web view and try clicking on home and recipes. Now we can see that the browser URL changes, and along with that we switch between the home and the recipe component. If we navigate to the recipes component and type S, we have the spaghetti carbonara, but clicking on that will load the respective recipe within the recipe list page. Actually, we need this to be shown in the recipe detail page. That is the change we need to do using routing by adding recipes slash the ID of the recipe, and based on that, we need to show the respective recipe in the detail page. Since we are currently in the recipe list page, let's fix a few things before moving to the recipe details page. Here, let's remove this condition because recipe list is no longer going to render the recipe detail. Instead, that's taken care of by the routing. And let's import router link, because instead of having a click, what we need here is an anchor tag that wraps the div. And let's apply the router link to go to slash recipes, comma, recipe.id. So when the user selects on one of the two recipes, we should go to the recipe details page with the respective recipe ID on the browser's URL. Let's see if that works till this point. If we type either S or C, we should see the respective recipe, and clicking on that should take us to the recipe detail page. Yes, the page broke because there are a few things that needs to be tweaked for the detail page to work, but with respect to navigation, we have the logic right. To fix this, let's move back to the recipe detail page. Let's remove this line where recipe detail expects input to be passed from the parent, because now the recipe detail is no longer within the recipe list, but we reach recipe detail via routing. So the recipe input, this one, is no longer valid. If you notice in the browser, what we have is recipes/1, which is the ID of the recipe. To grab this from the browser URL, we can inject a service called activated route. Equal to inject of activated route. And once we have this, let's do private read only recipe ID equal to this dot activated route dot, there is something called snapshot. From the snapshot, let's take params, which gives access to the parameters in the browser. And what is the parameter we are looking for? The ID. And let's also inject the recipe service. Private recipe service equal to inject of recipe. Now what we need is the recipe, for which let's do protected read only recipe equal to this dot recipe service dot get recipe by ID and pass in the ID as a number. Now that we have the recipe, let's use the recipe here. And to make sure that the template reflects correctly, since the recipe is no longer a signal, let's remove the invocation from the template. Now if we switch back to the web view, navigate to recipe, click on S, click on spaghetti carbonara, we can see that the details of that particular recipe is loaded fine. If we go back to recipes and click on C and click on the caprese salad, the respective details of that is shown in the details page. And to confirm the same with Gemini CLI, let's head back to the Gemini CLI and type done. Let's scroll up and see what it says. Alright, it says all module 15 checkpoints are met, which basically means our solution is correct. But the AI tutor went ahead and made a small change in the route configuration so that the route points to the recipe page now. Instead of the home page, it's actually pointing to the /recipes. There is nothing wrong in the solution. It's just that the AI tutor might have been configured for certain solutions, and if our solution deviates from that, it auto-corrects itself. Another change it did is removal of the navbar. That is something which I personally didn't like, to be honest. But apart from that, this section was not easy, but if you manage to get yourself till this point, great job. Hang in there, we are almost there. 2 more modules and we are done. That's it for this video. In the next one, we will take a look at forms, which is one of the topic I hated during my initial learning days because there is so much magic done behind the scenes by the framework. I kept asking why and how. See you soon in the next episode. Thank you and bye-bye.